Oh, so welcome back. Today I promised, and we will spend some time on the four species: etrog, lulav, hadas, and arava. We're going to talk about them all. So in the reading of the Torah today that you had, we found the meaning of Sukkot in three different ways. First of all is to remind us of the temporary dwellings that we had when we came out of Egypt. Secondly, it's the fall harvest. And third of all, it's about taking the four species. Yesterday was Shabbat. We didn't take the four species, so we talked about the building and construction of a sukkah. But today, the Arba Minim are front and present, and they create a certain nostalgia and a moment in shul when you would walk in and you could smell the citron, the etrog, and the myrtle. Obviously, the lulav and the arava, the palm and the willow have no smell. But just greenery in general is what it felt like, especially if you were in the sukkah and you might have cedar, bamboo, etc. So the four minim are told to us in the Torah as you should take Pri Eitz Hadar, a beautiful, special, gorgeous fruit, and the etrog, being that kind of gorgeous fruit, has many, many features to it that make it, in some people's eyes, beautiful. It has the pitum, which is the top section here. The top section of an etrog is that little stem. Not every etrog has it, but if it does have it, because remember, an etrog grows like this on a tree. It hangs upside down. It's cut off over here. This is the oketz, or the tail. And this is the pitum, which is this beautiful little feature that if an etrog does not have, naturally it's fine, but if it had it and it broke, it is no longer kosher. If you drop your etrog and you break it, it's over. You're going to need a new one. So that is why kids generally have kids' etrog sets, which may not be kosher, but they are good practice sets. So basically anything that is not suitable for the adult market goes to the kids, and they still get to charge you for it, which is not a bad deal. Of course, it smells lemony, etrogy. Now this one here is greeny, but also a little bit of yellowy. It might have turned yellow over time, it may not. They come in all different shades. Some are deep green, some are larger. It depends where it comes from often. There are many etrogim grown in Israel, but they are also grown in Morocco. They're grown in Italy. There's a whole huge farming industry of growing etrogim in Italy specifically for export, because there aren't that many Italian Jews, export to Europe, but most significantly Israel. You probably don't know, though, that most of the lulavim that we get in Israel are in fact grown in Egypt, just so you know. So there's a huge export business from Egypt to Israel for the palm dates. Most of them do not come from Israel. And the aravot that you have. The aravot you would think could grow anywhere. Well, there are myrtle species almost anywhere, but there aren't myrtle species like this anywhere. And most of these, or many of these, come from Turkey, believe it or not. When there was a diplomatic spat between Israel and Turkey, the hadas industry was in trouble. The willow, on the other hand, is a much more local species, and it's the weeping willow that has become common to use. The weeping willow, and we'll start with that. Why the weeping willow? Why a willow in general? Well, one of the traditions of Sukkot is Chag Nisuch HaMayim, the festival of pouring of the water. Now, the festival of pouring water is part of, people could identify it as part of pagan ritual, in other words, the worship of nature and the worship of natural forces, which, by the way, Judaism in ancient times seems far more comfortable with than people do today. But the festival of Sukkot became a festival in which water was taken from the ground, poured back into the ground, and that cycle of water was symbolic of the hope that the rain would fall in its right time. The right time for rain was always considered the last few days of Sukkot. Just after the pilgrims made it home, that's when they wanted the rain. They didn't want the rain to happen immediately. So Chag Nisuch HaMayim, let's start with that, comes from the Gihon, or the spring that runs under Jerusalem. They would have a festival called Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the festival or celebration of drawing of water. And this was, as I referenced yesterday, this was a fire festival in which they specifically juggled torches of fire. And imagine the spectacle of looking up at the Temple Mount from wherever you are in Jerusalem and seeing it ablaze with gigantic cauldrons of fire, and seeing huge exhibitions of juggled fire moving up and down like stars in the night on the Temple Mount. And it was a celebration, obviously, with food and drink and music. And the rabbis want, when describing the festival, the joy of having survived Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and made it through Sukkot and surviving and being well, and the harvest is complete and everything seems to be ticking along, that was considered the height of celebration, and it was an unbridled festival that was so ecstatic. The rabbis say, if you never saw the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, you have never seen ecstasy or joy in your lifetime. Just imagine how incredible the celebration must have been. Here you have these serious, heavy dudes who just went through Yom Kippur with the sacrifices and the blood and the incense and the Holy of Holies and the colors and the changing of clothing and all the holy stuff, but they knew how to party because they understood each festival has a place and a role. Each festival has a job. There are those who will argue that every part of every holiday is serious. Well, I grew up that way, but I would argue every part of every festival is different and unique. Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the drawing of the water, was no different. So the water would come up and it would make its way. It was a celebration of drawing the water and then the party. And then the next day, it would come to, imagine this is the altar, and in the corner of the altar was a little pipe. And you take the water and you'd pour it into that pipe, and the water would go down that pipe, back down, right through the bottom of the temple, right back into the river or stream that it came from, the subterranean river or stream. That was how the Simchat Beit HaShoeva and the Nisuch HaMayim, the festival of pouring the water, were combined. We'll get back to the politics of that in a few minutes, but just keep in mind this beautiful cycle of water coming up, celebration, water going down, celebration, and the hope for a year of fertility and rain and good weather and so on. That is why on Sukkot we also have the prayer of Mashiv Haruach Morid Hagashem. We switch from Morid Hatal, which means who makes the dew appear, to the wind blow and the rain comes. It's a festival, essentially, that follows the harvest, in which we hope for a year, as mentioned, of fertility and good weather. And that is why in our tradition as well, we switch our language, because it's a new way of looking at it. Winter is coming. So that is the water festival, but that also references the willow, which lives on bodies of water. It specifically says Arvei Nachal. It has to be a willow that grows on water. And to be clear, anyone who knows how nature works can pretty much identify where underground streams are by looking at the kind of trees that are growing along a topographical line or so on. You can see that there's cottonwoods and there's willows and so on, all trees that live with deep roots and pick up water, subterranean water. Anyone who's had a weeping willow in their backyard that is not far enough from their house knows, with probably regret, that a weeping willow will go down deep and crush your pipes with its roots and so on. You have to be extremely careful where you plant willows. There are different kinds of willows, but the willows that we use, again, are the very tall, graceful weeping willows, which makes it look like the tree is bent over and crying, perhaps symbolic of the fact that we're hoping with, a bent head, hopefully humility for a good year in which we know that we have no control over nature. So that is the willow. The myrtle, of course, myrtles grow in wet, marshy, boggy areas, And myrtles have a beautiful smell, and they give off an oil which can be used. And I have myrtles that I've collected for many, almost, it feels like decades now, of Sukkot that I have. You dry them after Sukkot, and you just leave them to dry, put them in a jar. Anytime you want to smell them, you just crush it a little bit, and you get this beautiful smell. There are people who know how to make essential oils out of myrtle, and also tea. There are teas available. I believe there's a David's Tea. I think I remember going there once and getting myrtle tea. I'm not sure it quite did it for me, but it does exist. I do think you have to be careful, though. Not everything is drinkable or eatable. And then there's the lulav, which is the palm. So a palm branch. This, if you took this and let it dry, it would start to open a little bit. And if you let it open fully, if it ripened on the tree, it would open into a fan, and it would not look like this. This fans out as it dries and as it matures. Each branch splits into two. How do you know they split into two? Because that is what they use to weave these little holders from. I have cousins who actually know how to do this stuff. Apparently, I remember at one point trying to learn it. It's a little bit of a technique, but you take dried leaves, you split them in two. Now they form long strings, and you can weave it. And it's incredibly strong and incredibly tough and incredibly useful, not just in terms of the lulav, but even in terms of if you wanted to tie together beams of a home, or you wanted to tie a package together. They're very, very useful. I know that on Passover, which coincides with Easter every year, because Easter is the only Christian holiday that follows the moon, just like the Jewish holidays, which always follow the moon. You will see that on Easter Sunday, people or pilgrims walk with palm branches, because it's, Palm Sunday. And they have the same thing where they weave from this. This is obviously a reference to the ancient tradition in which Jews were celebrating. It's not clear, however, how Passover became the time of the palm, if in fact it was in Jerusalem, because there was no use for palms on any festival other than Sukkot. So it's not clear exactly how that transition happened. But having said that, you've got your four species. Your etrog, you've got your lulav, you've got your myrtle, and you've got your hadass. Now let's talk a little bit about what they represent. Well, the etrog is said to represent the human heart, sort of a heart-shaped object. Some say it also represents the form of a human being. Some say it represents the form of a breast. I got into trouble for saying that many years ago, but I don't think I will this time. The fact is that Shaddai, El Shaddai, God is known by many names, but Shaddai is the same root as the word Shadda'im, because it means sustenance. So this is the God of sustenance manifested in an object, but also an etrog has a beautiful hand feel. It has bumps. It has what's known in yeshivish circles as a gartel or a girdle. People pay big money for an etrog that folds in and out voluptuously. There's a lot of stuff there. There's Kabbalistic, there's fertility, and so on. I won't go into all of it, but there is a conversation to be had about how if somebody eats a pitum, especially women who have not yet had children, they often are prescribed Kabbalistically the pitum to eat, and that supposedly is an amulet for fertility. Don't know if it works. The myrtle. The myrtle, as I mentioned earlier, follows the Fibonacci series, which means that every single branch that you have, every leaf follows the exact sequence in a spiral going up the branch. If I turn this and I follow up the branch at exactly the same distance, one leaf from another, you will be able to spiral directly up the entire branch. It's a perfect spiral. It's gorgeous. And it smells really, really good. So here's the thing that they say about the four species. The etrog, which represents the human heart. The myrtle, which looks like a human eye. Here you go. If you look at it and you see a human eye shape, that's right here, right there. Does that look like an eye? Of course it does. This would be an individual's left eye, and that would be somebody's right eye. As a matter of fact, here, let's do this. There you go. You can now see person's eyes, right there. So that is pretty obviously symbolic of what we see and what we choose to see. And then you have the willow, and a willow has a very different shape, and it represents the human mouth. Those would be the lips, as opposed to the myrtle, which looks like an eye. So now you've got the myrtle, the eye, the willow, the mouth, and of course the lulav represents the spine of a human being. Together, you've got the makings of a person: a heart, a spine, a mouth, and eyes. Obviously, there's other components, but the key thing that we're trying to identify is that this is not a celebration of religion. This is a celebration of people. The right heart, speak the right words, see the right things, don't follow your eyes inappropriately, and have a spine, or stand up straight, or help others. There's a blessing that people say, if you're observant and you do the tefillah, every morning you have a blessing called Zokef Kifufim. Do you know what Zokef Kifufim means? I don't know, I just say it. No, you shouldn't just say it. Zokef Kifufim means who straightens the crooked. That's such a great metaphor, but it's also about straightening the crooked. People who are in need of physical sustenance, people emotional support, that's what it's about. So we have a lulav to remind us to be Zokef Kifufim, straighten, speak well, see well, and feel well. All those things. Now, other people say, other rabbinic sources say, that these four species also represent one of the critical solutions to many of the problems we have, which is a lack of unity. In other words, where people don't like each other for stupid reasons, mostly. And this is how it goes. The etrog smells really, really, really good. But you can't eat it. It's really not edible unless you process it like my mother and make it into liqueur or make it into jam, but it's a lot of work. It's like days of washing and draining and tons of sugar. It barely tastes like etrog when you're done. So an etrog smells incredible, but not really edible. However, we're going to let it be edible because with work it can be. The myrtle, on the other hand, smells really good, but is not edible unless you turn it into something else. But it's not an edible product. The lulav has no scent. The spine, the palm, no scent at all. But its tree does have a lot of fruit. And the arava, on the other hand, has no fruit, has no smell, and is a pretty dull color. Now you've taken all the personalities of the people you know. There are people who smell good, but they're tasteless, essentially. There are people who smell good and are tasteful. There are people who neither tasteful nor good. And this, the rabbis say, is about behavior, action, and attitude. There are people who have good attitudes and little action. Great action, bad attitudes, and so on. And every permutation in between. Essentially what we've done is we've taken all the challenging personalities that we know and the great personalities that we know, and we've said, for this holiday, we're bringing everybody together. It's just past Yom Kippur. We've sought forgiveness. We've offered forgiveness. We've, in our minds, cleared our decks. We're no longer giving away our brains rent-free to the people who hurt us. And now here you go. You got all these people irritating you. So Sukkot is yet another reminder of ways in which we can forego people's failings, and a reminder that on a festival in which we're all together in Jerusalem, it's a time for achdut, for togetherness. I think this is an interpretation that comes much, much later. The original interpretation was obviously about the agricultural significance of these products and the places they come from. They all come from a place of water. The lulav needs water, it needs irrigation. An oasis is where you would find palm branches. One of the first road stops that the Jewish people made was at an oasis where they found palm trees. That's where they found water, and that's where a large part of the Torah was given, post-Sinai. But whenever you found an oasis, you found water. And wherever you found an oasis with water, you found palm trees. So there's no surprise that the palm represents water in a place of desolation. The willow obviously represents water, but it represents water that is subterranean. It's not visible necessarily. Its water is deep down. Whereas the myrtle grows in marshy, wet areas, so the water is near the surface. But an etrog, the etrog is a human construct. It is something that maybe grows naturally, but barely. It needs a lot of loving care and tenderness and constant watering, and it needs full attention to achieve what it gets. One of the problems with etrogs is that to get the unblemished skin, the skin without white or black dots or whatever, it needs a ton of care, like pesticides, or sometimes they grow them in sealed containers. The etrog is literally, the moment it buds, they put a container over it that seals it, and it allows for air in, but no bugs and nothing else. It's just an incredible thing. You didn't know how much effort goes in. That's why an etrog will not cost you less than $40 or $60. There's real work that goes into an etrog. And there's a conversation just recently published about how an etrog is originally a Chinese fruit. None of it bothers me. I think it's just adorable that the Jewish people have figured out how to combine the pagan and the spiritual in such a beautiful way and continue it to this day. For those who need to see it as halacha, as law, and have thousands of rules, good for them, because it keeps them in the game. And for those of us who see it as something meaningful on a deeply spiritual, physical, natural level, good for us. It keeps us in the game too. And if you can combine the two, you end up with thousands of years of history in which not much has changed because we sort of push at each other. Those who want to see it as abstract have to have a form. And those who want to see it as a form also learn how to abstract it with midrash, but fundamentally it's about the law. So together we've kept the lulav and etrog similar for decades and decades, in which we have continuously had the same imagery. And in fact, when they find in the Galilee, they find synagogue mosaics, you still see these species, although the etrog is a little bit less clear what it really was originally. But suffice it to say, it had to be a beautiful fruit. Now, I promised you yesterday I would tell you a story of the myrtle and the lulav in Killarney, and here's how it goes. So years and years ago, I worked for Belmont Construction, which I think is no longer, the company split, it's multiple companies now, and I found this incredible thing on the work site. I had an office not far from here, actually. It's really interesting how life is a full circle. The last project I worked on with Belmont was 960 Lawrence Avenue West. It was a doctor's building, and also their head office at 970, which is literally a stone's throw from Beth Torah. So I get to drive by it virtually every day, and I remember how much I didn't like the precast on the building. Anyhow, not for now. But I had an office in the back of that building that I was there every day during construction, early in the morning to late at night. And I remember we had a fantastic site super who was incredibly dedicated. This was a guy, he was one of those old school construction managers who literally was as hands-on as anything imaginable. And on a night when the concrete wasn't setting properly, he was out there late at night putting up tarps and setting up heaters himself with his staff, with his workers, late at night, and then he had to drive back to Barrie and back in the morning. And I couldn't believe that people like this exist, like an old sea captain, someone who was 1,000% devoted to his ship. And I learned a lot from just watching the dedication he had to the construction site. And then, of course, in the construction business, when it's over, you pick up and you leave. You don't get to stay. So I watched and learned, and then one day I went to my boss and I said, listen, I need to ask you something. I got to be on the site at 5 in the morning, and I want to be able to put on my tefillin in the morning and pray. And I don't feel comfortable doing it in my office because people just walk in and out and whatever. I said, can I build a prayer closet somewhere I can just be in the corner? Eventually, when the site super came to understand what it was, yeah. But in the end, we used it as a tool shed as well. So that way, there was no surprise. We were building a tool shed where you keep the expensive tools under lock and key in the office. And that's how I got my prayer closet in the office. It was a little awkward when someone would come in and look for me, and I couldn't speak and had to wait till they left and then sneak out of my closet again without my tefillin on, and then contact them and let them know I'm back in the office without ever having come in and out of the front door where they were just sitting outside waiting for me. Anyhow, miracles abound. So prayer closet, inside the prayer closet, are all these great tools, things I never knew existed, and I find a tube, and the tube contained a 4-foot drill bit. Now, those of you who know construction knows there's a time and a place for a 4-foot drill bit. There was a 4-foot drill bit in there. And at some point, the drill bit was used, and it broke, and it was rusted, whatever, so the container was available. I took that container because it made the perfect, absolutely perfect lulav container. You could put a lulav inside that container, and it would be protected from everything. Those things were hard plastic. Brilliant. So I had this beautiful neon orange lulav container. A friend and I went up to Algonquin to celebrate Sukkot in the park, because we're better, as I said yesterday, to celebrate Sukkot than in nature. And we found ourselves in the middle of a rainstorm, and we set up our tent on an island. And little did we know, on the other end of the island was another campsite. It wasn't very far away, but in the rain, you don't know what's going on around you. You just check, make sure you get some dry space, set up our tent, we got a fire going, and so on. And of course, we have our canoe, and we're unloading our stuff. And we hear voices, so we go to inspect, we say hello, we check in, we agree to check in the next morning. The next morning, we're there, and it's Sukkot, and I'm carrying this long tube, orange tube. And the couple who were there, not identifiably of any religion or another, say, what's in the tube? I said, oh, it's a palm branch. A palm branch? Oh my God, that reminds me of my grandfather. During this time of year, he used to walk to synagogue with like a tube, like a plastic thing with a palm branch in it for, what was the festival, Sukkot? And sure enough, there we were on this beautiful little island in the middle of Killarney Provincial Park, and we were reciting the blessing over the lulav and etrog in the middle of absolutely nowhere, using a tube from a drill bit, from my prayer closet, from Lawrence and Dufferin. Well, friends, that is what brings people together, is the nostalgia of feeling it and seeing it and knowing that it exists. It's important to embrace it. This is why it's so important to touch and feel and shape and have olfactory senses so that it becomes part of you. It's no longer abstract. Judaism does not like the abstract. It wants it to be tangible, touchable, real, and it lives inside of us forever if we do that, especially when we make the effort to see beyond the law and whether we have the precise kind of lulav, whether the lulav is split too far on the top or whether it's open enough. Now watch this. Look at what I'm about to do. There are hundreds of images that you'll see that look like this. Right? Go online, you'll see Hasidic Jews inspecting their lulav tips and so on, because there are rules about the splitting. They're doing the same thing with a magnifying glass with their etrog, and it's great. And I'm not knocking that. But what I'm saying is, imagine if we put that kind of care into all the mitzvot, into all the things we do, including the mitzvah of bringing people together or respecting human beings on a fundamental level. That is really what's happening on Sukkot. We're demanding more of ourselves. The same adherence to the beautiful agricultural festival is the same we should put into human beings. Now, I mentioned earlier, and with this I'll conclude, the politics of the pouring of the water festival. So here's the deal. The Kohen Gadol, as I mentioned on Yom Kippur, if you weren't worthy, you didn't make it out of the Holy of Holies. But let's say you did make it out. Or let's say you didn't, and they appointed someone in your place. Now, you're the high priest. But what if you're not part of the Pharisee world, or the Prushim, which means the holy, sacred Jews? You're part of the Tzedukim, or the Sadducees, or sort of like I couldn't even use denominational terms of modern times because they just don't apply. It was sort of a difference between whether you were more literally interpreting the Torah or whether you were more adhering to rabbinic authority. That's kind of the subtle difference at that point. To us, it might be subtle. To them, it was really significant. And one of the ways in which you could tell who was whether they adhered strictly to the code of law or not. And in many subtle ways, the Sadducees try to subvert the rule of the Pharisees. So one of the things that they did symbolically was they tried to avoid pouring the water down the tube. And they kind of poured it off to the side instead of down the tube. So I guess sort of to subvert and be able to say, haha, you didn't get your cycle completed, whatever that meant. But that's the way it was. So if the high priest was a political appointee and maybe not the right person for the job, and they were part of a sort of a denominational affiliation that was not strict, and they poured it off to the side of the hole there that was on the table, well, you might not get your atonement or penance or whatever was important to you, or your rain. People took it very seriously, so they watched carefully. And still it persisted. And there's a story of the priest that came to pour the water, and when it came time to pour it, he poured it off to the side, or just kind of missed the hole, so to speak, and they pelted him with etrogim and killed him. So there were thousands and thousands of worshipers, and you can imagine what happens if you get hit thousands of times with an etrog. I'm not sure how true the story is. I assume it's true. I assume that there is mob rage and terrible things happen. But it just gives you an idea of the intensity of the temple and how things went awry when it was politicized, and how that politicization manifested itself in the ritual of the altar. You'll notice that we have aravot, willows, in front of our bima, and that is specifically because in ancient times they had aravot decorating the temple, and they had it on the altar. And when they did Hoshanot, the prayer where they circled the sanctuary, they circled this box of aravot, essentially. Again, symbolic of completion and completing the cycle, and the cycle of rain and wind and so on, and the shift of seasons. They wanted everything to fit in its right time and its right place. So that is why Sukkot is such an incredible holiday. It incorporates so much that is significant to us, whether it be our sense of smell, our sense of taste, or our identifying of people who are other and how to incorporate them into our lives, and political subversion and authority and rabbinic versus, literal, or even more importantly, abstract Jewish observance or halachic Jewish observance. And as I said earlier, we need both. We need each other. Everybody is important. On that note, I'll conclude here with Chag Sameach, and we'll be back in a few minutes with the conclusion of services. I have something very special for you coming up in a few minutes.